The African Union last Thursday suspended Gabon's membership 24 hours after the military officers in that country ousted President Ali Bongo Ondimba, the first regional response to the 8th coup in West and Central Africa since 2020. The takeover brought an end to the Bongo family dynasty's almost 6 decades in power and creates a new conundrum for a region hit with a wave of coups that Nigerian President Bola Tinubu called a contagion of autocracy. Like other juntas who have snatched power in the region, Gabon's military leaders are seeking to consolidate power despite international condemnation. General Brice Oligui Nguema, the coup leader and former head of the presidential guard, is due to be sworn in as president on Monday. Tinubu, is chairman of ECOWAS, commented in the aftermath. "My fear," he said, and I quote, "has been confirmed in Gabon that copycats will start doing the same thing until it is stopped." End of quote. In the meantime, Gabon's main opposition group, Ordonnance 2023, has called on the international community to encourage the junta that overthrew President Ali Bongo to hand power back to civilians. Spokesperson for the group, Alexandra Panga, said the celebrations that followed the coup against Mr. Bongo was justified, but emphasized the importance of reimposing the constitutional order. The junta has said little about its immediate plans. Ordonnance 2023 said it wanted a full vote count from Tuesday's election, which was called in favor of the ousted president by the Electoral Commission. The spokesman said the opposition hoped to get an invitation from the junta to discuss the Central African country's transition plan. Still on Gabon, the new military rulers have reopened the country's land, sea, and air borders with immediate effect, according to the spokesman for the army. However, the 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew remains in place. Military officers closed the country's borders after announcing they had overthrown President Ali Bongo last Wednesday. The military ended the Bongo family dynasty's almost 6 decades in power and created a new conundrum for a region that has struggled to deal with coups since 2020. Order in Gabon, 90 years old President Paul Biya of Cameroon quickly made key changes and appointments in the central administrative unit of the country's defense ministry. In a decree dated August 30, 2023, President Biya issued a series of decrees appointing the rector of the University of Ngandere, officials in some universities, and other, transforming the consulate of the Republic of Cameroon at Ouesso, Republic of Congo, into a general consulate. Biya is Africa's second longest serving leader, and he has held power as president of Cameroon since November 6, 1982, and is due to complete his current term of office in 2025. Similarly, in copycat fashion and apparently responding to developments in Gabon, President Paul Kagame of Rwanda last Wednesday approved the retirement of 12 generals and several officers, including those whose contracts of duty have ended. Kagame also ordered a number of other officers to leave the army on medical grounds. Well, joining us now on the program to discuss all of this is Ambassador Segun Akinsanya, Ambassador Olusegun Akinsanya, who has been a member of the African Union Peace and Security Commission, an ambassador to Ethiopia, and permanent representative of Nigeria to African Union and the Economic Commission for Africa, ECA. Good to see you again, sir, Ambassador Akinsanya. Thank you very much for joining us. Well, all of these developments.
Yes, thank you very much.
All of these developments, the coup in...
Thank you very much, Ruben.
Yes, sir. Thank you for joining us. The coup in Niger, July 26, and now another coup in Gabon on the 30th of August. And President Tinubu, having warned previously about copycat syndrome. Now we've seen that majorly in the Francophone countries in Africa, we've been having these coups, one after the other. And it looks to be developing into a self-fulfilling prophecy. What went wrong with the democratic consolidation process in Africa?
Well, thank you very much, Ruben. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure being on your program. The developments in Africa in the last few months, the resurgence of coup d'etats, it's a retrogression of the democratic processes that was painstakingly worked on in the 90s, first from the OAU to the AU with the Constitutive Act and various instruments that tends to promote democracy, zero tolerance to unconstitutional change of government. But what we are now seeing is a retrogression. And with the coup in Niger and also the coup in in Gabon. Before then, we had Guinea, we have Burkina Faso, and also Mali, and also some dots of military interregnum in Egypt, even Egypt, but SCC has now translated into a civilian leader. Sudan, it's not out of the woods yet in terms of the military incursions. All these are retrogressive processes to democracy in Africa. And what we have seen in terms of the reactions of the people is jubilation. They are on the streets, applauding the military, the juntas as a savior. This is very unfortunate because the leaders that worked out on this Constitutive Act, the Mbekis of this world, Obasanjo, Bouteflika, and quite a lot of others, they were very optimistic that with all these instruments, political leaders in the various countries in Africa will oblige. But what we have seen is that was not the case. Hopes were shattered. There was massive underdevelopment. There was bad governance, and all this led to all this the present situation. There was also the problems of seat-tightism by some leaders who have spent quite a lot of their years, some into dynasties, the Paul Biyas, the Musevenis, the Mbasogo Nguema, who also caused a coup against Masias Nguema. So one can even classify that as part of the dynasty, even though the Marcus Nguema was assassinated and give way to Mbasogo Nguemas. All these phases, and even with Museveni, with Ouattara's elongation of term limit, they are all just reflects the bad leadership we now have in Africa, and the people getting fed up that dividends of democracy that they all look forward to was not achieved. There are other factors, and this is the warning trend in Africa, to the extent that some narratives that are now coming up is that are we back into the festival of coups? Are we back into the arrays of coups? And what if some coups happen in some systems? Will people be happy? That's why some people have been quick to say that, are there now good coups and bad coups? For me, all coups are bad. because these juntas don't have the wherewithal to rule. They are not meant to be ruled. They are meant to be in the barracks. But I think the reality of African situation is that our political leaders need to buckle their belts. The so-called dividends of economic of democracy are not met, and this is very worrying, because it makes nonsense of all the legislative the instruments that were in place. I recall that in the AU there were painstaking negotiations on the peace and security architecture, painstaking negotiations on African governance architecture, and zero tolerance to unconstitutional rule, and then also the Agenda 2063, which provides for economic prosperity, democracy, and then silencing the guns as a plank of the Agenda 2063. But all these have now been rendered very, 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 very useless. That implementation has been faulty. As part of this, also you have the African peer review mechanism, which was set up specifically to peer review African countries, as the French would say, entre nous. Look at what you are doing right, and you do it right, and you forgo what you are doing that is bad. There was also the CODA and the NEPAD, which have seemed to me to have lost steam in terms of implementation. So with all these arrays of hopes, bad governance, lack of economic development, not meeting the dividends of democracy, and also, of course, not living out the new narratives about the colonial powers that people are getting fed up with, particularly with the French. Have their basis, in fact, in some systems. I also served in Central African Republic as my first post. With the French basis and the prevalence of the French presence, they are really being called the alternative government. But things to be changing. This seems to now be changing against the French, and of course with other powers in the loop, the Chinese, the Russians, and of course the Americans that have various interests. So these are all the issues. But as far as the AU is concerned, I think the Rex, I mean, I want to identify a difference here. By the United Nations Charter, the Constitutive Act, and other instruments, the RECs, the regional economic communities, are supposed to be building blocks towards the African development, African unity. And ECAS, for the Central Africa, for instance, has been very ineffective. I mean, you saw the difference in terms of what ECOWAS did. They called it the principle of subsidiarity, that regional economic communities, being nearer to the people, take some firm actions. ECOWAS came out, they had a series of meetings, they applied sanctions, they made some contact. But ECOWAS, we've not heard about the ECOWAS meeting. It's because the whole of the Central Africa, is inundated with ISIS tight leaders. Congo, Sassou Nguesso in Congo, even the Democratic Republic of Congo is not completely immune to all this. They still have a lot of conflicts. Cameroon, you have the 90-year-old, still the thinking is moving strong, even when he should be calling it up and to call an elections. And you also have the Gabon with the dynasty. We hope Yadema is not going to do the same because he's in the seat of his father now, and the father has stayed there for long. So all these are all the issues, Ruben.
Ambassador
why,
Akinsanya.
and this is why people are now coming into the narrative. What way forward for Africa in terms of democracy?
Well, Ambassador Akinsanya, it will look like the African Union, after all, is ineffectual in the face of the failure of all those mechanisms that you have outlined. But we've seen the reaction from Paul Kagame of Rwanda, who has sacked generals and about 1,000 officers. We have seen the reaction by Paul Biya. Do you think that is going to dissuade a further spread of the coup contagion in Africa, particularly now that people are speculating which country is next? I've seen some people say Senegal is next because Macky Sall has toyed with the idea of extending constitutional term limits, or it should be Togo, where there is another dynasty in place. Even if in Gabon, what we have seen is not really an end to dynastic rule. After all, General Nguema is a cousin to Ali Bongo Udimba, and there have been speculations that maybe his sister, Udimba Senior's first daughter, Pascaline Bongo, has a hand in the entire affair. What do you think? Would this dissuade further adventurers?
Well, see, you know, you've identified quite a lot of problems within Africa. The interrelationships, the personal relationships, and the way some leaders see their rule. In my career, I served in Central African Republic, which was during the time of John Bede Bokassa. And one can see more in terms of the types of Mobutu and others, what they were for them, for most of the French-speaking countries, and particularly in East Africa, Central Africa. Central Africa, you know, as I said, there was democracy deficits, and they are not the Rex is not very effective. But I think what is very important for countries, you know, around these various regions, is to now come out with a rethink, a rejig of what democratic rule portends for Africa. I've suggested in other fora that perhaps an emergency, an inclusive, extraordinary summit of the AU is desirable at this time. And it's not only to have leaders that will come for 2 or 3 days in Addis and have a lot of discussions, reading scriptures, but there is need for introspection. There is need for an emergency meeting that will also bring in maybe some traditional leaders. I mean, we saw the Emir of Sokoto, Sultan of Sokoto, playing very important role, you know, in Nigerian political process in terms of peace and security. Having somebody like that across Africa, and also getting the research institutions, some research to be part of that process, that structure. Maybe they will meet before the Permanent Representatives Committee meets, and then before the Council of Ministers, and then the summit, to really have a heart-to-heart discussion on these issues. Because I believe that democracy, the liberal democracy, will seem to have failed in Africa. The liberal democracy, it has failed in Central Africa, in West Africa, and, it has failed. Because, when we talk about democracy, the classic one by the Greek is for a limited population. A limited population. But things have changed, which give way to Whitehall democracy, which the British government, for instance, even though they have no constitution, but they have no written constitution, but you have quite conventions. You have conventions, you have treaties, and so on. So for me, I think in Africa, we need to now do a rethink and find a way of how do we domesticate some of those very good values of Africa. I think this, to my mind, is otherwise all these things will keep on popping up. The leaders will come. Elections has now become a peace and security issue.
Okay, Ambassador Akinsanya.
When the election is announced somewhere, yeah.
Ambassador Akinsanya, just before we go, let's bring it to...
Hello?
Yeah, I wanted to raise an issue. President Tinubu has recalled all the ambassadors, all Nigeria's ambassadors on postings outside. Now, that has generated some concern among some Nigerians who think, oh, this is Tinubu recalling ambassadors so that he can put his own APC people there. Is there something to worry about there? Or is it just a routine procedure that when a new president comes in, it is entirely his prerogative to choose those who represent the country at various missions abroad?
Well, you raised a very topical issue, an issue that has cropped up to the surprise of many people. Yes, the president has the constitutional power to choose, appoint, and recall his ambassadors. It's not going to be the first time, but the best practices all over the world is to stagger such postings. Don't do a posting as if there is a crisis. That has always been the way we appoint our ambassadors in Nigeria. After the executive council, the ministers, those who are not able to get ministerial appointments will be lobbying. I think the recall, even though it has happened before in our system, it's not the best practice. It's like there is a crisis. It's only in a place like Nigeria that we appoint ambassadors, we recall ambassadors as if there is a crisis. And, in other countries, you don't even know when they post the ambassadors. Because you have a mix here of career and non-career. And the career people are people that they are posted and one can see the effectiveness. But non-career, because we have always, within ACAN, we have always made a case for a strong representation of career people because that is where they belong, And of course, you have non-careers, but putting the round pegs in round holes is the way forward. I think the recall of all ambassadors does not portend. It's not a good one. One cannot question the president because he has the constitutional power to do that. But it is not the best practice. It could have been staggered. And they were given a period, maybe 1 month or 2 months to pack. It's not easy. You have to take leave of your host government. You have to prepare. Your children are possibly in school. I think, whatever the advice, who advised our president to do that, I think it's in the bad taste. And you should have been advised that at least for continuity, will have been staggered in such a way that there is continuity. We don't give the impression that there is a crisis. Other climes, it's not the best diplomatic practice.
Okay. On that note, Ambassador Akinsanya, I would like to thank you very much for joining us on This Day Live, the Sunday talk show here on the Arise News Channel.